Professor George Gantzias is pleased to have the opportunity to share a few remarks about the infocommunication power and politics at summer school on socio-political crisis and new governance challenges, organized by Link Campus University in Rome with International Sociological Association Research Committee Sociotechnics and Sociological Practice and Italian Sociological Association Political Sociology Section. The title chosen for his lecture is Infocommunication Power and Politics, Global Control and Local Resistance. He is afraid he had to fit rather a lot into his lecture, and so some of the arguments are a bit compressed. He has dealt with the development of infocommunication power, politics, regulation and digital currencies. How infocommunication regulation affects both the political process and digital economy in infocommunication globalization. He has also dealt with the theories of regulation, the public interest, digital currencies and the banking system. So he would like to spend a bit more time to explain about the definition of regulation, the theories of regulation and the role of public interest in infocommunication industrial platforms. In addition, he analyzes the theories of regulation as a main factors to understand better the role of infocommunication power and politics both locally and globally. Finally, he would like to recommend strongly that the infocommunication power as a process should be subject to the definition of public interest and the emergence of an official new digital currency, that is the global InfoCash Euro, GCEU. According to George Gantzias, in the second decade of the 21st century, socio-political markets and the digital transactions system has been exposed to a political, cultural and economic crisis. Infocommunication power is the rational capacity that enables an infocommunication actor to influence asymmetrically the decisions of other infocommunication actors in ways that favor the empowered actor's will, interest and values. The concept of infocommunication actors refers to a variety of subjects of action: individual actor, collective actor, organizations, institutions, and digital networks. The ongoing transformation of infocommunication power and politics in the digital age extends the reach of infocommunication industry to all domains of social political life in a network that is at the same time global and local, generic and customized in an ever-changing pattern. As a result, infocommunication power relations, that is the relations that constitute the foundation of all socio-political platforms, as well as the processes challenging institutionalized power relations, are increasingly shaped and decided in the infocommunication socio-political landscape. At the same time, infocommunication power in cultural and creative industries, and increasing digital transactions, has meant that nation-states have become more socially plural, multicultural and global. These developments have provoked counter-pressures for infocommunication regulation and re-regulation to maintain or restore local socio-political order in a free market economy. In infocommunication socio-political power, we can identify the opposed principles between the market versus public services and between consumers' choices, democratic citizenship and transaction rights. In addition, the notion of freedom, responsibility, accountability and transparency, which are the cornerstones to develop a culture of democratic citizenship, are important ingredients in order to set up a global regulatory framework of infocommunication power and a global currency mechanism, that is the global InfoCash, GCEU, in a free market economy. In order to gain a better understanding of the infocommunication politics, the regulation of digital currencies and the governance of the Internet, it is essential to look firstly at the theories of regulations and the conditions and circumstances in which they have their roots in a free market economy. By examining the origins and development of the digital transactions in a free market economy, in particularly the attitudes which influence the digital transactions systems, it is possible to learn about how the present control structures for digital transactions assumed their shape and are gradually transforming a local market platform into a global infocommunication market platform. Regulatory arrangements do not arise in a vacuum, but evolve over a period of time, and within the context of a particular set of political, economic, social, and cultural determinants. Despite the huge increase in the scope of its operations and in its technical capabilities, the story of digital transactions and info communication power is mostly a case of plus car change, plus ka Islamiyum chose. However, as the theoretical framework for analyzing regulation and digital transaction in info communication landscape, George Gantzias uses John Francis's exclusive definition of regulation and Robert Horwitz's classification of 5 general categories of regulation theory together with the dictionary definition of regulation. Professor Gantzias pointed out that the dictionary definition of regulation is to control by a rule, to set up a framework of rules governing an area of activity. There is no absolute agreement as to what is meant by the term regulation in the context of public policy and in an info communication free market economy. It is used in many different ways. Perhaps the most common usage is state intervention in the running of private businesses or in the growth of a free market economy. An even more general definition is provided by John Francis in The Politics of Regulation, the intervention by the state in private activity in order to realize public purposes. This covers the inclusion, for example, of regulating digital transactions and payment systems by introducing a digital currency locally in a free market economy. The majority of state regulation is nevertheless aimed at controlling the commercial activities of private enterprises for a wide variety of social and political reasons. These reasons may or may not be justifiable, but at least the state in a democracy should come up with some fairly good justifications for interfering in digital currency affairs, or in info communication politics, or regulation will just be evaded or ignored. For example, Bitcoin is an experimental digital currency created, managed and transferred, spent, via a peer-to-peer info communication network, over the info communication landscape via internet users running a specialized computer program. A Bitcoin is a string of numbers generated by a powerful computer network system and is normally stored in computers without any transparent, reliable or accountable global regulatory official mechanism. The Bitcoin can be used as a payment system by any retailer who accepts Bitcoins as a reliable payment system, or transferred to any individual running a Bitcoin computer program. As a payment system, the Bitcoin is not regulated by any government or commercial organization, and, as such, there is no local or global official regulative mechanism to support each Bitcoin. According to George Gantzias, the Bitcoin will encourage the money laundering process and make it easier for launderers to turn legally obtained money into clean, untraceable funds. Within this context, a global regulation mechanism for peer-to-peer digital currency does not exist at the moment. Historically, regulation, particularly in America after 1945, became a huge industry in itself. And in spite of all good intentions and the amount of money spent on it, it was often not very successful. Economists and political scientists developed a number of different theories about why governments were so keen on the idea, what it actually achieved, if anything, and why it failed when it did. Practically all the important theorizing about regulation started and was then developed in the United States using the American experience as the empirical background. Robert Horwitz makes a useful general classification of 5 different types of regulation theory. George Gantzias emphasizes types of theory, not types of regulation, of which there are many more than 5. George Gantzias will give you a quick outline of these 5 types of regulation theory, which are as follows. 1. Public interest theory. 2. Perverted public interest theory. 3. Conspiracy theory. 4. Organizational theory. And 5. Capitalist state theory. They are not mutually exclusive, but overlap with one another to some extent. According to George Gantzias, the oldest and most influential of these is public interest theory, which was first formulated in the last century by public policymakers themselves. The state justified imposing restrictions on big pan-national corporations on the grounds that it was not in the public interest for small producers to go out of business from excessive competition. With the coming of the 20th century, came the mass market and the concept of the mass consumer. In the 21st century, the domination of digital technology introduces different digital currencies in our everyday payment systems. Public interest theory changed the focus from small producer protection to consumer protection and from producers' transactions to consumers' transactions. Regulation became a response to conflict between the general public and private corporations. The state intervened in the economy in order to ensure that large businesses with monopoly or partial monopoly status did not abuse their powers and exploit the consumer who was relatively powerless. In a cultural and economic crisis, governments should intervene in the banking sectors in order to ensure that customers' transaction rights or credit rights should not be abused by central banking powers or exploit the consumer who is relatively powerless. Public interest theory of regulation maintains that regulatory agencies are set up by governments not just to deal with excessive concentration of power in particular areas of special national importance, transport, telecommunications, banking industry, cultural industries, gas, electricity, water, etc., but to introduce rationality and fairness into the economic system generally. Regulation is also an expression of democratic reform as it protects the rights of citizens and banking customers to share in the nation's developing industrial infrastructure. It promotes efficiency and consumer welfare and not only the interests of banking sectors, politicians and the media industries both globally and locally. He pointed out, there are, however, some problems with public interest theory. It is a bit too idealistic and does not sufficiently recognize the effects of political and economic power. Capitalist democratic governments cannot function without the support of a central banking system both globally and locally. Whatever the good intentions behind the setting up of regulatory agencies, economic or political realities often dictate that regulation is frequently manipulated by central banking systems or politicians or the global media for their own purpose. Public interest theory also suffers from the fact that it concentrates on the genesis of regulatory agencies, that is, the reasons why they were set up first place, and it does not have very much to say about what happens after an agency has been operating for some time. It is just assumed that the public interest will go on being served automatically. Another difficulty is that it is not always easy to identify the public interest in any particular area of free market economies. The International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences says that the term is very elastic and relative. It has no a priori content waiting to be revealed. It simply indicates that some wider general considerations beyond the specific goals of interested parties exist. This means the public interest cannot be decided in advance, but depends on a given set of circumstances in a cultural and economic crisis. This is why different special interest groups with opposing solutions to public policy problems can all claim to be acting in the public interest, even though their proposals conflict with one another. Nevertheless, the concept has had a long history in decision-making on public policy and social value. In real life, things are more complicated than the black and white situations necessary for public interest theory to be true. Perverted public interest theory or regulatory failure theory tried to come up with some explanations of how the regulatory systems frequently fail to achieve their objectives. In the case of self-regulation of banking sectors, failure theory accepts the main premise of public interest theory, that is that regulation was originally set up in the interests of the public, but eventually came to be used as a tool by regulated industries or central banking sectors for their own purposes. The chief reason for this is that regulated industries or central banking sectors, by their nature, are extremely influential and are able to use their influence to persuade agencies to act more favorably towards them than towards consumers. Within this context, central banking systems or industries introduce regulation to serve their own interest of making profit than the interest of consumer, citizens. For example, recent austerity measures in Greece and the emergency haircut that was imposed on deposits accounts in Cyprus is the evidence that the central banking system introduces regulation to serve their own interest. One of the problems with regulation, especially banking regulations such as monetary or market regulation, is that it is impossible for legislation to do more than state general guidelines. Otherwise the system would be too inflexible to be able to adapt to so many different contexts and situations of use, which are always changing. The agency has to have considerable powers to make general policy and detailed rules itself, so there is plenty of scope for special interest lobbies to influence the process and procedures. According to Professor Gantzias, there are three basic models of industry or central banking systems which influence regulatory agencies: instrumental, structural and capture. Capture is really the broadest notion. Instrumental and structural factors often just help to explain why an agency becomes captured by the industry or central banking systems it is supposed to regulate. The instrumental model focuses on the role of individuals in the regulatory agency, in industry and central banking systems. People employed in agencies often used to work in the regulated industry or the central banking systems and have gone over to the regulation side because they have the necessary knowledge and expertise. They share the same social, economic and educational background and the same attitudes to business and banking institutions, which makes them sympathetic to a central banking system's or industry's point of view and not the consumers. If there is too close a relationship between regulators and the regulated, it makes it less likely that the regulator will be able to make the necessary tough decisions required. It will probably be inclined to ignore breaches of the rules and only introduce rules that don't interfere with the central banking system's or industry's ability to make profits. However, there is a limit to what individuals can do. Structural factors, such as the way in which agencies are constituted, their relations with the state and other institutions, their institutional remits and the amount of authority and level of resources they have, limit the options available to individuals. He pointed out that capture theory has been very influential in analyzing regulatory failure. There are various versions of it, but basically capture theory explains the failure of regulation to work in practice by the fact that the agency becomes captured by a central banking system which they regulate. The economic and political power of the central banking system or industry is stronger than that of the agency, and regulatory objectives are dominated by the central banking system or industry objectives. A combination of instrumental and structural factors contributes to agency capture. So, once an agency or the political parties has been captured, it stops working for the consumer and starts working for the central banking system or industry. The best account of capture theory is Bernstein's Regulation of Business by Independent Commission, which is based on the American experience. He sees regulatory agencies in terms of a life cycle, enthusiastic in their youth, with staff willing to take an adversarial approach to the central banking system or industry and to be vigorous in promoting the rights of consumers before the cultural and economic crisis. But after they have been operating for some time, as they enter middle age, they lose their creativity and become increasingly bureaucratic until in old age the system becomes hopelessly inflexible and regulatory function breaks down under the weight of rules and regulations, and they give up. Conspiracy theories go much further than regulatory failure theories. They do not accept that regulation is set up in the public interest at all, but rather that it is actively pursued by central banking systems or industry. It is not only consumers who suffer from the inherent chaos and instability of the free market, but businesses and central banking systems as well. For example, the digital currencies that is Bitcoin is likely to create chaos in central banking systems both globally and locally. Businesses have always tried to strengthen its position by mergers and by concentration of ownership, which, among other things, gives economies of scale. Digital currencies and the digitization of central banking systems are likely to create chaos in self-regulatory, monetary systems by challenging the traditional national or regional currency systems of paper money. But only the state or the central banking system has sufficient power globally to control the effects of market forces, and conspiracy theory sees regulation as a political institution designed from the start by the state, at the request of the central banking system or industry, to regulate the market for the sake of protecting business and traditional banking systems, rather than the consumer. Regulation, although it is supposed to restrict the power of monopolies and the central banking system's abuse of power, often acts as a means of cartel management. In particular, it facilitates the concentration of power, by controlling entry to the market and limiting competition, such as the European Central Bank Regulative Mechanism, which is going to be an active regulative mechanism at European regional level in recent crises. The European Central Bank Regulative Mechanism of the traditional banking sectors in the EU are likely to favor the centralized banking system's interest, and keep potential competitors out of banking markets. For example, in the case of digital currencies, the lack of regulation on Bitcoin was an incompetence on the part of European governments because the existing banking system and European leaders ignore the role of digital currencies in destabilizing the central banking system. The regulative model of the central banking system, which benefited from European centralized regulation, did not actually exist at the time when the regulatory mechanism at European level was set up. Conspiracy theory focuses on the closeness of big business interests to the political machine, and the effects of economic power on governments. It tends to be a bit one-sided, however, downgrading the state as an acting member of the EU while exaggerating the extent to which it can be used as a vehicle for special interest groups in the banking sector, at least in European countries, in particular Germany and Britain, which have strong central banking systems and two different currencies in the same European market. Organizational theories concentrate on the behavior of regulatory agencies as institutions. They recognize that organizations develop a life of their own which is to some extent autonomous from both the state and the regulated industries. The behavior of agencies cannot be completely explained in terms of their stated goals and purposes. Agencies tend to follow organizational imperatives as much as any other. In other words, they become concerned with preserving and extending their own power and authority, increasing the number of staff, and increasing the amount of rules and regulations for their own sake because that is what they are being paid to do. Organizations such as banking institutions hate to be blamed for anything. They don't like to take risks or to have their authority challenged, so they invent rules to cover every possible circumstance in order to cover up their own mistakes in the past. They tend to be secretive and unwilling to discuss the reasons behind their decisions. According to Professor Gantzias, organizational critiques of self-regulation on behalf of the consumers are influential in the centralized regulation movement in the banking systems of the EU. Consumers are very anti-self-regulation because they see it as severely restricting their freedom to ask for the haircut on loans. Their solution to promoting consumer welfare is not self-regulation. They regard this as the problem, but the central banking system, which provides consumers with more real choice through the mechanism of competition in the past, is out of date in info-communication globalization. Deregulation and privatization took power away from regulators and civil service bureaucrats and returned it to business or central bankers. In Greece, of course, because major public utilities, gas, water, electricity, telecoms, were nationalized, unlike in America, this produced the ironic result that new regulatory agencies had to be created in order to oversee the behavior of the privatized industries. So deregulation is likely to have as a result more regulation in some sense, although this is regulation to promote competition in as yet undeveloped markets. Privatization often just meant private monopoly rather than public monopoly, but not to restrict competition. Regulation at global and European level is very difficult to work due to the domination of digital technology in our everyday transactions, tax and payment systems. To create an effective regulatory mechanism to deregulate and privatize the Greek industrial sectors, it is an expensive process that requires a lot more money and specialized human capital, in order to organize an effective regulatory mechanism in privatized industrial sectors. If the Greek government has the intention to pay back its debt by the privatization of the industrial sectors, it will end up with a chaotic free market economy. Professor Gantzias pointed out that capitalist state theory of regulation focuses on regulation as part of a wider political theory of state intervention in the period of advanced capitalism. Regulatory agencies are seen as one of several types of state apparatus designed to safeguard the accumulation of capital, towards which the state is structurally biased, when the market fails to do the job. They are a means of social control which enables the state to maintain order in the market on behalf of central banking systems or industry, but which also makes it possible for it to distribute social benefits at the same time. According to Professor Gantzias, structuralism, Marxist theory, although the state is the main actor in a capitalist democracy, it cannot just do as it wants. It is bound by two main constraints: the constraint of accumulation of capital and the constraint of legitimation. This means that governments must do as much as possible to encourage banking interests and promote a healthy economy, but at the same time it should be answerable to the electorate who legitimizes its activities. It must therefore offer social welfare provisions to compensate the sections of society which do not immediately benefit from the accumulation of capital. The unemployed, the sick, pensioners, consumers, etc. Regulation is a mechanism for enabling central banking systems to perform well and pursue social and cultural objectives at the same time. Other non-Marxist approaches also emphasize the political rather than the economic dimension of regulation. Economists take an instrumental view of regulatory agencies as tools for achieving certain economic benefits, mostly in terms of promoting the most efficient use of resources. This is treating agencies as a completely passive means to an end. But the choice of regulatory institutions cannot be divorced from the broader political context. Regulatory systems are themselves outcomes of wider decisions about the relationship between the citizen and the state. Such decisions are about government and about the kind of society in which we wish to live. For example, there is a lot of difference, between the regulatory regime for the banking system in the US and that in the EU, and particularly in Greece. From the very beginning, just after the First World War, the US went for a monetary system, with a minimum of regulation, mostly to do with the transaction and payment system and so forth. There were no specific central banking requirements. The self-regulatory agencies for monetary policy only had a very general obligation to regulate in the public interest. In practice, the free market and the central banking system dictated the self-regulation strategies without any official statutory body of regulations both globally and locally. In Greece, where there is a very different social and cultural climate from the US and the EU, the central banking system took a very different form. The Central Bank of Greece, together with the political parties in Greece, encouraged a clientelism culture which in turn supported the granting of loans to political parties and big businesses without any strict rules or hardly any regulation. According to Professor Gantzias, are any of these theoretical perspectives applicable to the Greek central banking scene, considering that regulation of info-communication politics and the financial sector, especially of banking, is a bit of a joke, as far as its practical effectiveness goes anyway? It is worth having a look at public interest theory in this context as it relates to info-communication politics as system for central banking system and political parties to encourage the clientelistic attitudes in Greek citizens, customers. He pointed out, in recent crisis mass communication and central banking systems should be subject to public interest and statutory regulation mechanisms in order to avoid the clientelistic attitudes in info-communication politics. McWell has provided a definition that makes the concept of public interest more able to handle the very complex situation of the modern mass communications media, which raise so many different issues: freedom of expression, accuracy and truth of reporting, libel and obscenity, safeguarding of copyright and intellectual property rights, preservation of cultural diversity, advertising, etc. Policymakers have to decide between many conflicting positions on these issues and numerous competing demands from different interest groups. McQuail therefore accepts that the public interest in communications is heterogeneous and not unitary, and recommends treating various statements of public interest concerning communications as a set of competing claims or proposals with a normative component. It is then up to the political and legal systems to decide which claims are the most justifiable, usually by providing a general statutory framework for regulation and creating regulatory bodies to take care of the details. He pointed out, in most Western countries, Greece included, the broadcast media have historically been much more tightly controlled than the press because they have been perceived as more powerful in order to encourage the Greek to invest in very risky monetary system, stock market, customers loans etc. The press tends to be controlled under the law of the land on libel, defamation, obscenity and so on, though these vary in strictness from country, and even when not under dictatorship, Greece has had some pretty draconian press laws. Countries often have press codes and complaints bodies which are a form of self-regulation, but they do not have legal backing. Greece has had various press codes. Such codes were always claimed to be in the public interest but were in fact highly political and concerned mainly with preventing criticism of whichever government was in power. Since freedom of expression exercised with responsibility is a fundamental democratic right which can never be claimed to be against the public interest, government regulation of the press in Greece, even by so-called voluntary codes, has seldom been genuinely in the public interest, either in its motivation or its operation. Within this context, the banking system manages to manipulate the press system and broadcasting system which advertise its financial products and services without any specific restrictions in order to protect the consumers. He also pointed out that the case of broadcasting is a bit more complex. Licensing has always been the primary mechanism for the enforcement of regulation of the broadcast media, and Article 10(1) of the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees the right to freedom of expression, also permits nations to retain licensing systems for cinema, radio and television. This recognizes that there are technical and social reasons for some kind of direct state control over the broadcast media in the general interest. This is the term used by the European Court of Justice in interpreting the Convention, which is not incompatible with the right to freedom of expression and information. So Greek government regulation of broadcasting was not necessarily in principle against the public interest. Some Western European countries had public service broadcasting systems only until the early 1980s. The UK waited until 1973 before starting limited private radio. But as Professor Gantzias have mentioned in his previous books, the main motivation behind any Greek government's attempts to regulate broadcasting was party political, that is, in order to control the media for purely selfish purposes. There was rarely even a genuine desire to use regulation to provide the highest standard of broadcasting service, according to objective broadcasting criteria, not political criteria, for the benefit of Greek audiences. According to George Gantzias, the political motivation behind PASOK's reluctance to introduce deregulation in the 1980s completely destroyed the opportunity to create a new regulatory framework from a position of strength which might have taken into account some of the public interest claims such as range, quality and diversity of programming, technical standards and freedom from waveband, interference, impartiality of news coverage, media ownership issues, effective control of the amount and content of advertising etc. Instead, PASOK waited until it was too late to do anything but try desperately to limit the damage. It is much more difficult to impose regulation once a completely unregulated situation has become established. The regulatory mechanisms that were set up, supposedly to provide a better broadcasting service, were completely ineffective. It is almost pointless to talk about the earlier ERT regulatory bodies and the National Broadcasting Council as failing to regulate, as they had no chance of succeeding in the first place. They were structurally completely dependent on the political system, individually staffed mainly by political appointees and non-broadcasting interests. Any independent actions they tried to take were undermined by the state. Capture is also fairly meaningless in the Greek context. For capture to happen, you need first to have a regulatory agency which starts out with some power, but which gradually becomes influenced by the regulated parties over a number of years. In Greece, even after privatization became an acceptable policy option, the commercial television and radio industry simply carried on ignoring altogether any regulation which didn't suit them. The advertising industry in Greece has also totally ignored any attempts by ERT to regulate its activities, threatening to withdraw revenue, and actually carrying out the threats, if it could not do as it liked. He also pointed out that in the privatization period, conspiracy theory is the only one that has any relevance to the actual events in Greek broadcasting. The conservative government inherited chaos from the previous socialist administration, but instead of making a serious attempt to set up a clear, workable, non-political regulatory framework, near-democracia broadcasting policymakers got together with existing big publishing and industrial interests to ensure that frequency allocations, awarding of licenses and the drawing up of the terms and conditions of licenses, all of which are essential elements of any broadcasting regulation policy, served first of all the interests of the government and the private broadcasting companies and not the public. The political will to acknowledge wider broadcasting considerations beyond the short-term goals of special interest groups was lacking, and the Prime Minister was quite willing to use regulation selectively to impose penalties for breaches of the rules on broadcasters who opposed him politically. According to George Gantzias, capitalist state theory of regulation has something to say about Greek broadcasting to the extent that even under the socialists Greece basically operates a market economy. During the PASOK administration of the 1980s, the government concentrated on legitimizing its activities and gaining political support through social programs rather than through the accumulation of capital, as Margaret Thatcher did in the UK, for example. Privatization of broadcasting was a chaotic and badly planned attempt to introduce capital accumulation, that is the free market, into an area previously controlled by the state. The relations between the political system, the central banking system in general and the mass communications media in Greece have already been discussed, and regulation as a political institution is not in any real sense an expression of the kind of society in which citizens of Greece would wish to live, but just another mechanism of infocommunication state power and increasingly nowadays business and central banking systems power. For example, a global control and local resistance case in infocommunication power and politics is the case of closing down ERT broadcasting channels. ERT as a public service broadcasting channel was closed down in 2013 due to austerity measures by global economic forces and to European monetary policy pressures. In 2015, a public service broadcasting channels ERT are open again to broadcast their program due to the Greek government new legislation, local resistance against global control. However, ERT broadcasting channels together with the technical legal private channels and their digital broadcasting platform are facing serious financial difficulties at the time the Greek government is still negotiating with other European institutions about the future of European Union and the Greek humanitarian crisis. One main conclusion that arises from Professor Gantzias' lecture on infocommunication power and politics, global control and local resistance is that European institutions should consider seriously the above analysis of public interest in the role or infocommunication regulatory mechanisms in order to decide to introduce an alternative official European digital currency, that is the global info-cash euro, GKEU, in recent political, economic, social and cultural crisis. Infocommunication power is the most fundamental process in introducing the digital tax payment, transactions culture, since an official digital currency that is the GKEU is defined around public interest principles, global regulation mechanism, values and institutions, and what is valued and institutionalized is defined by infocommunication power relationship in digital economy.